Thank you for joining us for tonight's Future of the Past webinar. These webinars explore our diverse history to inform our future. My name is Beth Marsh, and I am the Director of Membership and Communications for the Organization of American Historians. Our webinar tonight brings together several of the contributors from the September 2022 Journal of American History special issue on the 1921 and 1924 Immigration Acts. The Journal of American History and the OAH, National OAH office are located on the campus of Indiana University, Bloomington. We wish to acknowledge and honor the Indigenous communities native to this region and recognize that Indiana University, Bloomington is built on Indigenous homelands and resources. We recognize the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. We are also pleased this evening to have the University of Minnesota Immigration History Research Center as a co-sponsor for this panel. This webinar series is made possible by a grant from the National Endowment for Humanities. Tonight's webinar is being recorded and will be available on the OAH site early next week. We ask that you please ask questions of our panelists using the Q&A feature, and OAH staff are available in the chat if needed. It is my pleasure to introduce one of tonight's co-hosts, Dr. Erika Lee. Dr. Lee is a Regents Professor of History and Asian American Studies. She is Director of the Immigration History Research Center at the University of Minnesota and President of the Organization of American Historians. She is the author of 4 award-winning books, including America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in America, and The Making of Asian America. Dr. Lee, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth. Welcome, everybody. I'm so pleased to see such a robust audience for tonight's program. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you from just outside of the Twin Cities, which is located on Dakota land. Today, many Indigenous people, including the Dakota and Ojibwe from throughout the state of Minnesota, call the Twin Cities home, and our history must account for past and ongoing injustices and Indigenous dispossession. I'm so proud to be representing 2 organizations tonight as Director of the Immigration History Research Center here at the University of Minnesota, but also as President of the Organization of American Historians. The OAH is the largest professional society dedicated to the teaching and study of American history. Our mission is to promote excellence in the scholarship, teaching, and presentation of American history, and to encourage wide discussion of historical questions and the equitable treatment of all practitioners of history. As Beth Marsh mentioned, this program is part of our Future of the Past webinar series, which explores our diverse history to inform our future. There are a number of past webinars that are available on the OAH website, and I encourage you to visit that site for, if you missed some of those programs, they're wonderful to keep up to date about the work and scholarship and advocacy of our members, but also to use in the classroom. And we know that this webinar will be equally useful. This evening, we're highlighting the Journal of American History's most recent special issue titled Immigration Restriction, Then and Now, Re-Examining the Impact and Legacy of the 1921 and 1924 Immigration Acts. This special issue was co-edited by myself and my good friend and colleague, Professor Maddalena Marinari. Professor Marinari teaches U.S. history at Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota. She's published extensively on immigration restriction and immigrant mobilization. She's the author of the book, Unwanted, Italian and Jewish Mobilization Against Restrictive Immigration Laws, 1882 to 1965, and is co-editor of A Nation of Immigrants Reconsidered, U.S. Society in an Age of Restriction, 1924 to 1965, as well as Whose America? U.S. immigration policy since 1980. We are so excited to have everyone join us, and I'm going to now turn the program over to Professor Marinari, who will introduce the rest of our panelists and help us begin the conversation.
Thank you, Erika. Welcome, everyone. It's great to be with all of you tonight. It's my immense pleasure to have this conversation, and now I will be introducing our speakers. Ashley Johnson Bavery is an associate professor of history at Eastern Michigan University, where she teaches courses on immigration and race in the United States. Her book, Bootlegged Aliens, Immigration Politics on America's Northern Border, examined policing and welfare on the Detroit-Canada border before World War II and won the first book award from the Immigration and Ethnic History Society in 2020. Our next speaker is Kevin Kenny. He's Glucksman Professor of History at New York University. His books include Making Sense of the Molly Maguires, The American Irish History, Peaceful Kingdom Lost, and Diaspora, a very short introduction. He has published articles in the Journal of American History and the Journal of American Ethnic History, among other venues. Professor Kenny's latest book, The Problem of Immigration in a Slaveholding Republic, Policing Mobility in the 19th Century United States, explains, which is forthcoming in 2023, explains how the existence, abolition, and legacies of slavery shaped American immigration policy as it moved from the local to the national level. He currently serves as president of the Immigration and Ethnic History Society and as a distinguished lecturer of the Organization of American Historians. We also have Carl Lindskoog with us. He's associate professor of history at Raritan Valley Community College. He's the author of Detain and Punish: Asian Refugees and the Rise of the World's Largest Immigration Detention System. He's currently writing a new history of the sanctuary movement from Reagan to Trump. With us tonight is also Mireya Loza. She's an associate professor in the Department of History in the American Studies program at Georgetown University. Her area of research includes Latinx history, labor history, and food studies. Her book, Defiant Braceros: How Migrant Workers Fought for Racial, Sexual, and Political Freedom, examines America's largest guest worker program. Her first book won the 2017 Theodore Salutis Book Prize, awarded by the Immigration and Ethnic History Society and the Smithsonian Secretary's Research Prize. Her research has been funded by the Ford Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Smithsonian's Latino Center. Prior to joining the faculty at Georgetown, she taught in the Department of Food Studies at New York University. In addition, she also curates at the National Museum of American History. Last but not least, Yael Schacher is with us. She's director of the Americans in Europe and Refugees International, a non-governmental policy organization based in Washington, D.C. In addition to her numerous policy and legal briefs on the subject, Yael is writing a book on the history of asylum in the United States since the late 19th century. She has published articles on the history of asylum and advocacy in the Journal of American Ethnic History and Global Labor Migration: New Directions. Yael received her PhD in American Studies from Harvard University in 2016 and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Historical Studies at the University of Texas in 2017-2018. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. I get to ask the first question, which goes as follows. So please briefly share with us what your article is about and how it helps us understand the origins, passage, and significance of the two immigration acts in 1921 and 1924. For this round, let's proceed in chronological order. So Kevin, why don't we start with you?
Okay, thank you, Maddalena. Thank you, Erika, and the OAH and JAH and everybody else. So my article is about the 19th century background to immigration restriction. And essentially, the question I'm addressing is, how was restriction possible in the first place? It's really a question about who had authority over immigration, who claimed authority, and on what grounds. And that may seem like a question with a very simple answer, because when I went into this subject, I assumed that immigration is a federal matter, the control of borders, and presumably always had been. That's a very ahistorical assumption, as I discovered. So in a country that attracted so many immigrants, it being the United States, you might expect you would find the answer in the Constitution. Of course, the Constitution says almost nothing about immigration. It does say something about immigrants after they arrive with naturalization. The point in the 19th century is that the federal government played almost no role in controlling admissions and exclusions before the Civil War. And the burden of my piece is to argue that as the existence of slavery and then the abolition and legacies of slavery are central to explaining the transition from local to federal authority over immigration. That and the context of westward expansion, which is also very important in the article I tell, which is an intersection between immigration policy and Native American policy. So very briefly, one might think that the Civil War, by removing the fundamental political and constitutional obstacles to a national immigration policy, somehow makes that policy inevitable. I want to argue against that by saying that even if slavery had been abolished a generation earlier, nobody was looking for large-scale numerical restriction, even of the Irish. So there is a historical contingency. That is the arrival of the Chinese. So the national immigration policy, when it becomes possible, is deployed against Chinese immigrants. Part of the point I make is that the precedents in practice for that policy of registration, exclusion, punishment, deportation lie partly in the antebellum South. And then finally, what I do in the article is I look for, well, what is the justification for regulating immigration such that the federal government could eventually restrict immigration, which is what our special issue is about. And in effect, the justification is extra-constitutional. The argument that the Supreme Court makes in the Chinese exclusion case is not that authority is to be found in the text of the Constitution, but that it is inherent in the sovereignty of the United States. This is the plenary power doctrine that we refer to in immigration history. So that's essentially the big picture framework that I'm sketching in the article as the background, I think, to much of what the special issue is about. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And just as a reminder, in case people need a refresher about the 1921 and 1924 acts, these are essentially two pieces of legislation that introduced quotas on immigrants from the Eastern Hemisphere, targeting in particular Southern and Eastern Europeans, but it also imposed a near ban on Asian immigration, and it expanded the list of exclusions against immigrants at large. And so the 1921 Act is a provisional law, but by 1924 essentially becomes the law of the land, and it won't be repealed until 1965. It will be briefly revised in 1952, but it's essentially a system that remained in place for 40 years, and it still shapes the current immigration policy that we live under today. Mireya, why don't you go next? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Maddalena and Erika, for the opportunity to actually produce the scholarship. I wrote an article basically based on this kind of interest that I've always had in guest workers and thinking about how immigration policy and law functions and how guest workers are sort of on the fringes of this policy. And so in 1917, we know that there's a quota, not a quota system, a literacy requirement and a head tax. And my big question was, how did Mexican guest workers basically make their way during World War I to the US? How were they recruited? What were their experiences like? And what I came to find was that growers placed enough pressure on politicians, lobbymakers or lobbyists, and were able to literally find loopholes to bring in guest workers, to recruit them, not that they hadn't done this before, but to recruit them despite the restrictions in the 1917 Immigration Act. And what this did is set a precedent for Mexicans and Mexican guest workers to sort of, again, utilize this outside of not only to be excluded from the quota system, but constantly to be utilized by agriculture, by folks on the border as well, in different industries and recruited heavily to work in the US. And so part of what I'm interested in is how is this experience on the peripheries of this immigration system, how does it change people's lives? How does it function on the ground? How are they recruited? What are they doing? And also, what is their in terms of how people experience a looming threat of deportation? And so what my article also sheds light on is how, this early, not bracero program, but Mexican guest worker program, how growers and employers use the threat of deportation to do away with any folks that they believed were pushing back, any folks that they believe were speaking too loudly. And so I'm more interested across the 20th century and how guest workers are, again, always on the fringes, how this immigration policy utilizes them and then literally sends them right back. And so, right now we have about 300,000 guest workers laboring in the US, and this legacy still lives with us and still is an integral part of our food system. So.
Thank you, Mireya. Ashley, it's your turn.
Thank you so much. Thank you again also to Maddalena and Erika and the OAH and JH for making this all possible. So my article looks at how the U.S. Border Patrol operated over the U.S.-Canada border. And you may know that the 1924 Immigration Act appropriated $1 million for the formation of a land border patrol. But most people don't know that in the 20s and 30s, the force spent a lot of most of its time policing the northern border. And it was in places like Buffalo, Detroit, and along the St. Lawrence River in New York that patrolmen really tested the boundaries of federal power on the border. And so my article really looks at how the 1924, 21 and 24 Immigration Acts were enforced at the border. And their enforcement was not a given. In small towns from Maine to Minnesota, locals resented the extension of federal power into their business. They protested as a policeman told them when they could cross into Canada, who could work in their fields and factories. And this caused the framers of the 1924 Immigration Act to really double down on the Border Patrol. They demanded more funding, and they begin to envision the organization as an actual military force. They do this by recruiting veterans. The early patrolmen had been postal workers because they were the only people who had the civil service exam on file. And so they start recruiting veterans. They encourage violent tactics at the border. They emphasize physical strength. And the effort is heavily gendered. They use language of toughness, assertiveness. They emphasize manhood, stamina, and kind of virility on the border. And so by the mid-1930s, as government officials start to look to policing on the southern border, where patrolmen were younger, less likely to have been served in the military, they actually look to the north and some of the people who had actually patrolled on the north actually are moved to the southern border and employ the same tactics then on the southern border. So you really see the connection between the northern and the southern border and how the militarization of the Border Patrol really develops. So I'll end there and then move on.
Thank you, Ashley. Yael, it's your turn.
Thanks so much, and thanks for having me. So my article argues that the quota laws were also, in addition to all the things that have been discussed, were also an attempt to keep out post-World War I refugees, especially from the fallen Russian and Ottoman empires. And that with the quota laws, what we actually see is a refusal to acknowledge forced migration, the idea of forced migration, or the need for an exception to the exclusion bar for people fleeing violence and persecution, what we would think of as like refugee law, right? There was an experiment with just such an exception in the 1917 immigration law that I discuss in the article. And it's specifically, I discussed the way that that exception to the 1917 law allowed Jewish and Armenian women to articulate persecution claims involving rape and sexual violence when they applied for admission to the United States before the quota laws came into effect. So around 1920, 1919, 1920. And I talk about how that narrow exception was carved out by Jewish lawyers, very narrowly, as an attempt to push back against restriction. And I would say, that is something that continues to this very day, the way that advocates try to make carve-outs into exclusionary legislation for particular populations. That's still something that's very much with us. But by 1921, what the article shows with the first Quota Act was that officials were sort of fixated on ferreting out the way that these women were being coached by advocates, thinking about their ways of getting around, thinking of them as sort of immoral, unaccompanied women of undesirable races, that their claims were not worth exceptions, right? These were not worthy of exceptions. And so what the 1921 and 24 laws were, as has been mentioned by others, they were about numbers. They were about a quantitative restriction on immigration with minimal exceptions, even for separated families, as became very obvious later in the 20s and in the 30s. So if you came after the quota was filled, your persecution claim would not get any assessment, period. Like that was it. And I would argue that, what the historian Marinari called the regime of quotas and papers that really started in this period created a system fundamentally incompatible with individualized qualitative assessments of immigrants. It is actually fundamentally incompatible with refugee law, which has a universal persecution standard that is supposed to allow people from all over the world to be assessed case by case about what their experiences is. And the desire to quantitatively limit immigration inevitably leads to bringing back into refugee law questions of race and nationality and mode of entry when you adjudicate those individual claims. So it starts to be all about restriction. So basically, the fundamental argument is that the way that asylum is being limited today, in those very ways, is very much akin to the way that asylum was limited with the quota laws. That's sort of the fundamental argument of the article. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Yael. And now it's Carl's turn.
Thank you, Maddalena and Erika, and everyone who made this project and this conversation possible. So my essay is about the long history of migrant detention in this country, tries to connect incarceration as a tool of state violence against foreign-born to a long history of settler colonialism and empire, seeks to explain the United States' current condition, I guess you might say, as a carceral settler state, as just the latest stage of this nation's development from its origin as a settler colony and then growth into a racial empire. One of the things my essay tries to do is to add to our understanding of the Immigration Restriction Acts of 21 and 24 by showing how these laws were in the 1920s used as a part of a much longer project of maintaining an Anglo settler state and an expanding racial empire. So for example, expanding US racial empire in the late 19th century created these networks for mass migration, but then this also undermined the integrity of the Anglo settler state. And so restriction was an effort to control these changes and was used in tandem with other tools used at the very same time of state violence and state control, such as at the same year, the creation of the US Border Patrol, the Indian Citizenship Act in the same year, and the Immigration Act of 1929. And then throughout this whole process, whenever it was needed, incarceration and other forms of violence were used, to reinforce and to sort of shore up these other things that were being implemented, including immigration restriction at the same time.
Thank you, Carl. Before we move on to the second question, I'd like to remind the audience that they're welcome to post questions in the Q&A function so that we can start asking them once the authors have answered the second question. And now I'll turn it back to Erika.
Thanks everyone for getting us started. I just want to give a brief background as to how the special issue came about. Maddalena first approached me and reminded me that it was going to be 100 years since the 21 and 24 acts had been passed. I think this was in 2018 or 19, so the before times. All of us who've been involved in this project, including the tireless staff of the Journal of American History, this was one of our COVID projects. And so under those circumstances, the incredible research and writing that has happened over the past couple of years is even that much more incredible. And I also wanted to note that there are a number of authors who've contributed to the special issue who could not join us today for this session due to scheduling conflicts, but I wanted to call them out. So Seema Sohi published an article called Barred Zones, Rising Tides and Radical Struggles, the Anti-Radical and Anti-Asian Dimensions of the 1917 Immigration Act. Adam Goodman contributed an article titled Defining American, the Bureau of Naturalization's Attempt to Standardize Citizenship Education and Inculcate, quote, the soul of America in immigrants during World War I. Romeo Guzman wrote Paper Trails, Repatriates, Mexican Consuls, and Transnational Mobility During the Great Depression. And Alexandra Minastern wrote an article titled From Race Suicide to White Extinction, White Nationalism, Nativism, and Eugenics Over the Past Century. In addition, Professor Marinari wrote the introduction to the special issue titled The 1921 and 1924 Immigration Acts a Century Later, Roots and Long Shadows. And I wrote an epilogue titled A New Era of Anti-Immigrant Hate and Immigration Restriction. Just a reminder that we were writing and talking to each other during the Trump administration, during the pandemic, when we essentially stopped admitting every category of migrant into the United States. So now I'm going to kind of bring us, that was a nice unplanned segue, but to talk about the present, to talk about both the immediate as well as long-term legacies of the acts. So I'm going to ask each one of you to reflect briefly on how your article helps us understand xenophobia, current immigration policy, misinformation, and the immigration debate today. And we're going to be bad historians and go in reverse chronological order this time. So I'm going to ask Carl to come back to start us off with this part of the conversation.
Okay, thanks. So I know this is about today, but in terms of thinking about the long-term legacies, I just want to sort of incorporate the long arc of my piece again and sort of bring it up to the present. So by placing these restriction acts in the longer history, which sees restriction and detention as complementary tools, both used to exclude and eliminate migrants and indigenous people and racialized groups, all in service of the Anglo-settler state. I'm trying in the essay to sort of explain the consistency of US policy over time. I'm hoping that it shows how 1921 and 1924 acts weren't necessarily such a departure from previous policy, and neither should maybe we see the reforms of 1965 as such a dramatic reversal. I feel like sort of recognizing both those things helps us understand our current moment. So maybe 1921 and 24 and 1965 were both just adjustments to maintain US racial empire in a changing world. And maybe that's part of how we need to understand immigration or anti-immigration politics now. I also hope that my essay shows that a legacy is in an ongoing way how policy adjustments and resistance to things like empire and state violence can create new challenges and require new adjustments by the state. So for example, by the 1980s and certainly by the 1990s, because of the challenges in a changing world and resistance, both domestically and internationally, I argue that the US is really sort of back in a position again that closely resembles the 1920s. So in the 1990s, new anti-immigrant laws, new border enforcement, other punitive programs, and now with the state able to wield or to deploy racialized mass incarceration against both foreign-born and American people, this was the late 20th century expression of the same settler state and racial empire that birthed the restrictions of the 1920s. And just to conclude, I'll say that, so I think we're still pretty much or very much in the same place as we were that came about in the 1990s. Border violence, migrant incarceration, and if anything now, connections between anti-Indigenous violence and anti-migrant violence is becoming more and more clear.
Thanks, Carl. I like the framing of 1924 and 65, or especially 65, being an adjustment. I remember, the way in which I was trained in graduate school, the historiography really until recently posited, strongly argued that 65 was this massive turning point and a return to normalcy, a return to our values as a nation of immigrants. And I think that all of the work that everyone's done here on this panel and in the special issue is continuing to question that. Yael, you had begun to talk about the connections with contemporary policy, but I'm going to give you even more time to elaborate on that and perhaps bring in some of your work with Refugees International as well.
Right. So this is a question that I think of. I spend my days thinking about contemporary policy. So I am very careful, actually, not reading history too much backwards. Right. I'm actually, I fear I would fall into that too easily. So I'm careful about it. But I guess like Carl, I mean, I think what actually writing this piece spanning two administrations, the Trump administration and then the Biden administration, doing revisions and realizing actually like not that much had changed, not as much as I was hoping, frankly. And then for, I think in refugee studies, or the big transitions that people usually point to are the immediate post-World War II period with the signing of the Refugee Convention and the 1980 Refugee Act, which brought that convention into US law and created the refugee system and or called for the asylums. What I also started to see was, what did those really make the difference that we think they did? And what this article made me think was actually more about continuity, in the same way that, maybe thinking about those as just adjustments rather than as fundamental changes to a paradigm we've been living in since the 1920s, from my view. And what I just want to say one other thing, which is that, like I said earlier, I think the quota laws repress the understanding of the causes of migration and actually denied them, and also made it impossible to effectively do what states so much want to do, which is effectively manage migration, right? That's the goal of states, really, to control and manage migration. And that's not to say that like extreme control efforts don't work. They certainly do. The quota laws led to a refusal to see the harm of deterrence policies and the harm of exclusion policies. If the goal is deterrence, when deterrence is achieved, success, right? If we define that as the goal of the law, then they all look successful. And that laws and policies may separate families is not a particular problem. That they may deport stateless people into danger is not a particular concern, right? And frequently, the discretionary efforts used to humanize laws that are fundamentally inhumane and whose fundamental goals are exclusion and deterrence and they're inflexible, leads actually to policies of admitting people into like temporary and limbo statuses, which is what we kind of saw in the 20s when there were efforts to sort of humanize the laws, and the same thing is happening today. So those are the kinds, those are the kinds of patterns I think we see. And I kind of agree with Carl that some of the fundamental turning points I have thought restructured things maybe seem to me less significant than the continuity.
Thanks, Yael. I also want to remind everyone in the audience to use the Q&A function to add a question. Ashley, your turn.
Great, thank you so much. So my article looks at the ways that militarization of the border really shows how federal policing and military-like enforcement was really far from inevitable. So in the 1920s, particularly looking at the US-Canada border, we see how locals really fought enforcement because they resented federal encroachment into their affairs, and pushback was so intense that congressmen considered disbanding the Border Patrol altogether. And so in response, policymakers proposed making the Border Patrol part of the Coast Guard, which is an actual branch of the military. That didn't happen, but it shifted the debate from whether the patrol should exist to whether it should be a military force. And so we see similar efforts today on the US-Mexico border as policymakers really don't question whether there should be policing or patrol on the border, right? But what sorts of guns patrolmen should carry and the rules of detention, right? So we see similar efforts to kind of shift the discussion about border policing to be kind of even more extreme, right? And so you see policymakers, local sheriffs saying, oh, well, if we detain everyone, then that will work, right? And the response is, oh, well, we should have less detention, right? So there's less, it really shifts the conversation about border policing to be much more extreme than even people on the ground wanted at the time. And we see similar things going on in the US-Mexico border. Again, it's hard to make direct comparisons, but I do see some things that are kind of patterns developing, right? And militarization and checkpoints on the border, of course, have become normalized. But in the 1920s and 30s, harsh border policing appeared super radical and garnered a lot of criticism. And we've kind of forgotten that, right? And was criticized by a range of different people. So it's really important to emphasize how these policies were once discussed on both borders, right? So the northern border was a major part of the conversation, and policymakers in Michigan and Minnesota were really worried about border policing. They were worried about border patrol. They were worried about labor regulation, things like that, for the same reason that many people are today on the southern border. Oh, shift, yeah.
Your article reminds me that as border security or border patrol patrolling became more normalized in the early 20th century, so did the militarization of American society too.
Right.
And finding that connection, your work does so well for that period. Thank you. Mireya, I'm going to bring you back to comment on immediate and long-term legacies of the acts from your perspective and your research.
At least from the topic that I researched, and the immediate sort of legacies are that we still are grappling with a system that really wants to render these workers as workers who are perpetually temporary. So what I found, similarly to Yael and Carl, is that this had a deeper seed and much deeper roots, especially when most folks think about guest workers. They think about the largest guest worker program, the Bracero program, and they think about the 4.5 million contracts that were issued during the life of the Bracero program. But what I sort of was surprised in finding is that this had a deeper root in 1917 in the first war, and that growers really, and employers in general, wanted the workforce, but they wanted a workforce that was flexible, disposable, expendable. And I think that that is what we're sort of dealing with today. We're dealing with a system that naturalizes this idea that we can have people laboring for their entire lives on temporary status, coming back and forth to the US, and that we don't need to give them permanent belonging. We've naturalized this idea that Mexicans are the beast of burden in fields, and that's just because of their poverty or because of the choices that they've made, and not because we have created a system that exploits them. And more, what I found was really interesting is that, although the first Mexican guest worker program was quite distinct from the Bracero program in that it relied on family labor. And we see that shift around family labor, and especially children, with sort of the 1930s and this idea that children should be protected, right? And even though those policies don't apply to children in farm work, there is a sense that we should not be recruiting entire families and children to do this kind of labor, and the Bracero program presents that kind of shift, that we should, rely on men that will not have children can have children, but will not, in ideas, have children on US soil. And moreover, like what I thought was very surprising is that in the current sort of agricultural work and H2 programs, there's an entire wing of folks that are arguing that for equity's sake, we should now include women, that women should be included as guest workers, and that we need to use this kind of program not only to ensure that we have more gendered parity, but that we can also spin these programs as international relief, because US aid is now considering funding guest worker programs. And the USDA also in some ways is supporting this kind of work around guest worker programs. And so what I find is this perplexing moment where I scratch my head and ask, have we gotten to the point that we've naturalized it to just this greater public in the US that has no awareness that these people come in, labor, feed us, and quietly leave, and how unfair that is?
I think we're all scratching our heads on so many things, but that is definitely one of the areas that your research helps us understand both the continuities and the expansion of these issues. Last but not least, I'm going to bring Kevin back to the conversation to have us think about long-term, immediate and long-term legacies of the Immigration Acts and related to your work.
Great. Thank you, Erika. And so we circle back to the 19th century, and just want to suggest 3 ways in which perhaps understanding the 19th century context is helpful for this second question. The first has to do with what we call crimmigration, or the nexus between immigration and criminalization and incarceration today. There's so many precedents or things to look at in the 19th century. For example, laws in the southern states in the antebellum period confining free black sailors to jail or to their ships for the duration of their stay in port. This applies to native-born free black sailors coming from Massachusetts to South Carolina, just as much to British sailors as well. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 uniquely directed at African Americans, but some scholars find precedence again for the arbitrary nature of deportation in the postbellum period. The imprisonment of Chinese laborers prior to deportation, punishment prior to deportation, which itself was not defined as a form of punishment. So these are things that I look at under the heading of crimmigration broadly. The other points are maybe bigger, but I still think fundamental. I start with a question about authority. Who has authority over the mobility of people? who claims authority over immigration. We take for granted, I suppose, today that immigration is a federal matter. Earlier in this conversation, I talked about the emergence of what we call in shorthand terminology, the plenary power. There's really two things going on there. One is a claim to sovereignty, not the claim that sovereignty, control over national borders is inherent in the sovereignty of the nation. The plenary dimension is the allocation of that power to the so-called political branches of government, which is the legislature and the executive, and the idea that the judiciary should back away from it. The persistence of that strain of thinking, I don't think requires emphasis in what I'm saying. It was the basis for upholding the so-called travel ban in Trump versus Hawaii in 2018. What strikes me as a historian is the strangeness or the peculiarity of the claim, because it is a claim based on sovereignty over national territory. But at the time it's articulated, there are hundreds of sovereign and semi-autonomous political entities with territorial claims to the land. And I think that's a theme that runs through to the present. The third point, and the final point I want to make, has to do with the broad field of immigration federalism. So in the story I tell in the 19th century, the question, who has authority over the mobility of people, comes down to a struggle between commerce power at the national level, police power at the state level. It cannot be resolved before the Civil War. It takes a civil war to resolve this question, because any state laws regulating, say, the arrival of paupers into Massachusetts and New York intersects with laws regulating the lives of free Black sailors, the movement of free Black people, potentially even the interstate slave trade. When the Supreme Court looks at these issues, it backs away. It cannot. It's in a conflict that cannot be resolved until the Civil War. The point I want to make about today is that immigration federalism is alive and well. Police power didn't go away when national sovereignty was exerted. What I'm seeing that's so interesting to me is a bifurcation between you have immigration policy in the sense of controlling borders. That's a national matter. But you have policy on immigrants once they're in the country. And that's where state police power is so important. The bifurcation is that state sovereignty and police power today, it cuts both ways. It can lead to Proposition 187 in 1994. It can lead to Arizona SB 1070 in 2010. It can actually be an attempt to monitor, to police, to control, and to deter immigration. But it can flip around into the sanctuary movement and into attempts to define state citizenship as protecting the rights of all residents, regardless of their origin or their background. And so we end up in a situation where, and it's so relevant in terms of COVID, reproductive rights and immigration, where you live in the United States determines your rights, privileges, and benefits. So I see the question of immigration federalism as it played out in the 19th century, still playing out, but in a different way today.
Thank you. We're going to turn over to questions and answers from the audience. So last chance to pose a question. I know that we're not going to get to all of them, so apologies in advance if we are not able to answer your question, but we'll try to group some together and try to answer some of the more common themes and questions that are being posed. Maddalena, do you want to start with the first question?
Sure, happy to. So one of the questions that seems to be coming in several different forms, and I appreciate all the excellent questions that are in the chat, is one from Nathan Elstrand. So he asks, were there similar trends of immigration restriction that parallel the US and other nations, particularly settler colonial ones such as Canada, Australia? I was wondering if maybe Erika would like to go first, and then we'll turn it over to our authors.
Yes, and I think I'm going to try to pair that with a question from one of my University of Minnesota colleagues about whether the 21 and 24 acts were purely quote unquote domestic processes, and how did the international system and foreign policy impact those changes. And I know Maddalena has a lot to say about that as well. So very quickly, and I'll speak just to the aspect of Asian exclusion. And as Kevin has already mentioned, the exclusion of Chinese and actually almost nearly all other Asian migrant groups predated 21 and 24 acts and were solidified with the 1924 Immigration Act. And we see almost simultaneously exclusion laws being passed in Canada, largely because, related to Ashley Bavery's research, the Chinese migrate once the borders to the US were closed. They found loopholes and went around to several different other ports of entry, including crossing the borders from Canada into the United States and from Mexico into the United States. So we see exclusion laws being passed in nearly every white settler colonial nation, but also in countries throughout Latin America where there is very little Asian immigration. And so one of the things that I think is something for all of us to think about is how it can be the specter of immigrants rather than immigrants themselves that can shape policy, and to think about how that bears not just historically, but also in our contemporary world as well. Maddalena, do you want to add anything about the impact of and the coordination of domestic as well as international factors that shape 1921 and 1924 acts?
Sure, I'll be brief. I think, and this I think addresses one of the other questions about 1917. So one of the major points that you can see across the entire issue is how much of the momentum for the passage of the 1921 and 1924 acts starts during World War I, right? And we really cannot understand why all of a sudden restricting European immigrants, which many Americans and legislators had opposed to for decades, all of a sudden becomes legitimate, right? And so I think while increasingly Americans start seeing immigration restriction as a domestic issue, it's definitely clearly connected to international developments as well, both in terms of what Erika was describing, this global push for immigration restriction, but it's really World War I that precipitates a lot of anxieties about immigration, naturalization, and more broadly, the desire to limit who can come in, and even more important, who can become a citizen. So they're all interconnected, and these are global conversations. I don't know if any of our authors here would like to address this question as well.
I might just say very, very briefly that if you look at the settler colonial societies that Erika mentioned, and you take the Chinese case, what interests me is, in the American case, there's a vocabulary and a set of practices derived from the existence of slavery that frames the debate and the policy. In Australia, it works differently. So the British imperial setting is different from the American context. And then Marinari, of course, has argued recently in her book, The Chinese Question, that there's also a coalescence. In other words, an international anti-Chinese ideology emerges. But looking at the different conditions of labor to begin with, and looking at the different contexts of empire and slavery, and then adding onto that a layer of coalescence is, I think, quite interesting.
And if I could just add, I do think it's World War I, and it's also the Bolshevik revolution that also creates this anti-radicalism right after, it's the first real effort to deport en masse for a second. I mean, it doesn't actually turn out to be a mass deportation. And certainly, but I think that there was this opposition, there's this fear of radicalism that also was involved with the war. I know that Seema's article is also about this, but I think that the Bolshevik Revolution gave not just the US, but other countries that fear of communism that did contribute also to it sort of trying to define Americanism, as Maddalena said, in opposition to that as well. And that I think also contributed to it.
I just wanted to jump in. Those are great points. And in the Canadian, what I wanted to emphasize is that the United States' quotas, though, in 1924 and 1921 and 1924 are some of the most complete and some of the least forgiving acts that are passed. So if you look in the Canadian case, just to the north, the Canadian government does pass immigration restrictions that do target people they call from, first they exclude Chinese immigrants, and then they divide Europe into preferred and non-preferred countries and exclude people from non-preferred countries, Southern Eastern Europe and Italy. But by 1925, people can say that they're going to work in farms in Western Saskatchewan and Alberta, and they can get entrance then. And all they have to do is put down that they're farm laborers and come to the United States. So the demand for labor in some of these places that are settler colonial societies, the demand for white labor is making it so that people can come in and get around some of these laws for longer periods, right? So they do, and then a lot of them don't stay on those farms very long. They continue on to Toronto or continue west. So we see the 1924 and 1921 and 1924 acts are some of the most exhaustive, I think.
There's so many good questions, and I'm afraid we're not going to get to all of them, but I'm going to pose one last one and open it up to anyone who wants to address it. But this one is from Yuko Kono, and they ask, do you see any strategic difference in the way advocacy groups for immigrants fight injustice, past and present? So I think I'm actually going to ask Yael to start us off with that one.
That's a great question. I think what I'm most interested in is the way that the anti-immigrant movement in the 1920s and today fragments advocacy. And what you saw in the 1920s was a quietness by advocacy groups because they were worried about eliciting backlash, and so they tempered their demands in order to worry that if they push too far and for more admissions, they would actually make things worse, which is actually hard to conceive of making things worse, given what Ashley just said about how bad the restrictive laws were. But this defensiveness that it creates among advocates for immigration is very apparent. And I think today, what you're seeing, for example, I find it extremely depressing, is so today, I'll give an example of this. Like, there's a coalition of groups that all work together for example, increased access to asylum at the border, but also the regularization of undocumented immigrants who have lived in the United States for a long time. And what you actually see now happening is in a very uncompromising Congress, which is about to get even more uncompromising with the new elections, and nothing getting done. You see okay, well, maybe we'll trade DACA for border control. And so you see the asylum folks, being like, well, okay, you see fragmentation among what had been a unified movement. And in some, ironically, the movement was much more unified under the Trump administration than it is now. And so I think this is a very complicated question. But a consistency is, different ethnic groups carving out special provisions for their own groups, which you see in the 1920s and you still see today with, very specialized bills, as I mentioned earlier.
Thanks, Yael. Does anybody else want to contribute some thoughts about this last question, advocacy, past and present?
Definitely. I think at least when it comes to guest workers, there are many advocates who attempt to protect guest workers, and we saw that in, the first Mexican guest worker program. We see it again in the Bracero program, but, more and more what I'm seeing in the contemporary period is that, advocacy is split into two definite camps. One that is attempting to limit and argue against the expansion of guest worker programs. And then the other camp that is attempting to figure out what funding there is out there, what to do to make their way into contracting, whether that is a traditional unions who have now become labor contractors. And I think by and large, what we're losing sight of is that protect guest workers, don't protect guest workers, expand the program. What we're losing sight of is that this is an unfair system, that it should not happen. And that, if the job requires someone else to be exploited from another country, then we need to reform the job.
I will just add very briefly that once 1921 and 1924 pass, essentially the approach is that any change to the status quo is better than the status quo, but that means that there's a lot of compromise and challenges to bring together really broad coalitions, because politicians know how to divide and conquer these coalitions, right? And to say, well, if I give you just this one thing, and because the status quo is so bad, right? There are not that many options that they have to agree.
Can I say one really quick about, so this, I've got a comparison between not the 1920s, but the 1980s and the present for immigrant advocacy. And thinking about the sanctuary movement of the past and present, this current sanctuary movement sort of knows its history and definitely takes inspiration from the earlier chapter. But a big difference that really, I think, undermines the current sanctuary movement is that we don't have a strong anti-war movement that can fit into and complement it like they did in the 1980s. We're coming out of the anti-Vietnam War era. They really just direct that against, against American imperialism and imperial violence in Central America. Those two things are always, part and parcel. They go together. Advocating against state violence in Central America and against violence against migrants at home gives them all kinds of tools and vision that the sanctuary movement sadly doesn't have now, because the anti-war movement is so weak now.
I want to thank everybody for joining us, all of our speakers and authors here tonight: Carl Lindskoog, Yael Schacher, Mary Loza, Kevin Kenny, Ashley Bavery Johnson, and my co-editor, fearless co-editor, co-moderator, and I forgot to mention she is also president-elect of the Immigration and Ethnic History Society, Maddalena Marinari. Thank you to OAH staff for helping to organize this event. If you're interested in these issues, and why shouldn't you be, we will have a much more fabulous program, more conversations, exhibits, and tours related to immigration, to xenophobia, to race at this year's OAH Conference on American History. It's in LA from March 30th to April 2nd, 2023, and then it will also have a whole set of other programs online as part of the OAH virtual conference series on American history from April 13th to May 4th. You can learn more, and the link that will be coming in the chat. Please check out the special issue in the Journal of American History. As you can tell, we had some fascinating conversations over the past few years. This is some of the best work in our field on immigration. We all care about this subject deeply, not only for what it tells us about the past, but also for how it can help us understand and act today. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to the OAH as well. Have a good evening.